They didn't burn flags this time. They burned silence. It was early morning in Nairobi, the kind of humid dawn where every shadow feels heavier than usual. By 7 a.m., thousands were already on the streets. Students, elders, street vendors, tech workers, and drummers. Not because someone had told them to, but because someone had finally gone too far. Spray painted across the gates of Kenya's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in thick red letters were 5 words. Nairobi is not AFRICOM HQ. And just hours before, the city had welcomed a man whose name was now spreading like fire. General Michael Langley, the highest-ranking U.S. military officer for Africa, stepping off a jet under tight security, barely touching ground before rage began to bloom. His visit was supposed to be quiet, simple. A defense summit, they said. A handshake. A press photo. But it didn't go that way. It couldn't. Because Langley hadn't just arrived with a delegation. He arrived with a wound. A wound opened weeks earlier when, in a cold, fluorescent-lit Senate hearing back in Washington, D.C., he had accused a young African leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of BurkinaFaso, of hoarding national gold, using it not for his people but to fortify his junta. The words sounded like policy. But they hit like a betrayal. And now, here in Nairobi, the entire continent was speaking back. Chants echoed off skyscrapers. Africa is not your base. Langley, go home. We stand with Traoré. Langley, hidden behind walls and guards, never saw the full sea of anger rise. But the streets did. And so did history. Because this wasn't just about one man in uniform. It was about how long a people could be told how to run their house before they stand up and say, enough. But the part that no one expected, not the journalists, not even the protesters, was what came next. A short video, filmed under the shade of a baobab tree in the West African village of Sagal, began to go viral. In the video, a circle of old men, guardians of history, spiritual guides, spoke not in English but in Wolof and Mandinka, their voices slow and heavy like thunder wrapped in silk. One of them looked straight into the camera and said, "Michael, you were born from this soil. And now you stand against it. You have forgotten who you are." The crowd in Nairobi went quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop. A U.S. general of African descent, publicly disowned by his own bloodline. And that's where we begin. If this story moves you even a little, take a second to like this video. It helps more voices hear it. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because this story belongs to all of us. Now let's go back to where it started. It wasn't the first time Africa had hosted a foreign general. But this time was different. And the world knew it. Only 24 hours before the protests exploded in Nairobi, Langley had landed under the quiet cover of diplomatic language. On paper, he was there to attend a high-level security forum, a routine check-in between U.S. and Kenyan defense forces. But nothing about 2025 was routine, because across Africa something was shifting. The Sahel was rising. Countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had expelled Western forces. They were realigning, choosing new allies, taking back control. Not just over their militaries but over their stories. And at the heart of that wave stood a man in fatigues, not suits. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Young. Military trained. Sharp-eyed. Unshaken. Since rising to power, Traoré had taken back parts of Burkina Faso's gold industry from foreign hands. He redirected the wealth to train local soldiers and build small rural infrastructure. He removed middlemen. He stood up to France. And he never apologized. To many in the West that made him dangerous. To many in Africa that made him ours. So when Langley weeks earlier sat before U.S. lawmakers and accused Traoré of misusing gold, without mentioning the decades foreign companies had looted that same land, the insult didn't just land in Ouagadougou. It landed in Kinshasa, in Accra, in Addis, in Johannesburg, and yes, in Nairobi. It struck at something old and still bleeding, this idea that African leaders can't manage their own wealth, that freedom must come with supervision, that sovereignty is only acceptable when it plays by foreign rules. Langley's words weren't just dismissed. They were remembered. And now they had followed him to East Africa. The sign said it clearly. This is not your continent. You insult one of us, you insult all of us. For the Kenyan government, the moment was delicate. Too delicate. President Ruto's administration, which had long cooperated with the U.S. on military intelligence and joint training programs, said nothing. No clarification. No distancing. Not even a pause. And that silence, it burned. Students in Mombasa began organizing through encrypted chats. Elders in Kisumu spoke out on local radio. Pan-Africanist influencers on TikTok reposted Traoré's speeches dubbed in Swahili, with captions like, "This is where the gold is going." Then came the graffiti. "Langley brings war, not peace. Kenya is not a colony." Soon there were rallies in Freetown, in Dakar, even in Tanzania's Dar es Salaam. Across the continent, a single idea was spreading like wildfire. This is not just about one visit. It's about what that visit means. And that, dear listener, is the power of symbols. Because Langley did not only come with military boots. He came wrapped in the memory of Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi, leaders discredited before they were destroyed. And so the people shouted his name. Not to welcome him, but to warn him. If you've made it this far into the story, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear this. The time for Africa to rise isn't tomorrow. It's now. And as for General Langley, the story isn't over. Because before the summit even began, something unexpected happened in the corridors of power in Nairobi. A leaked memo. 2 senior Kenyan advisors had warned, do not host him. Not now. Not like this. But they were ignored. And that choice, that one quiet decision, will cost more than anyone imagined. The streets were still pulsing the next day. Tear gas hung in the air like a bitter perfume. Shoes left behind by running feet dotted the pavements. And inside a luxury hotel, draped in the flags of Kenya and the United States, General Langley stood behind a podium, speaking into microphones that could no longer drown out the noise outside. His voice was calm, controlled. He spoke of regional security, counterinsurgency cooperation, and shared values. Words chosen by careful hands. But out there, under the Nairobi sky, people weren't listening. Not because they couldn't hear him, but because they'd already heard enough. To many watching from across Africa, the summit wasn't a show of partnership. It was a display of obedience. And Kenya, long known for its diplomatic grace, now stood accused of something far heavier, betrayal. Across campus halls in Eldoret, dorm rooms in Nairobi, radio stations in Kizii, young Kenyans were asking a question too loud to ignore. Whose side are we on? And worse, are we next? Because while Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had cut ties with Western forces, kicked out French troops, and declared new sovereignty over their resources, Kenya had opened its doors. Not just to a general, but to the very symbol of the system others were tearing down. And still, Nairobi's silence stayed firm. No apology. No context. No rebuke. Just a photo of Langley shaking hands with uniformed officials, while protesters choked on gas outside the gates. If this message is striking something in your heart, take a second to like this video. It helps us reach more people. And let us know in the comments if you believe this kind of silence is ever justified. Because for many across the continent, it wasn't just frustrating. It was familiar. We've seen this before, haven't we? When Western powers accuse African leaders of being too strong, too independent, or too unpredictable, while ignoring decades of extraction, manipulation, and shadow wars waged through debt and diplomacy. That's what made Langley's attack on Ibrahim Traoré so radioactive. He hadn't accused the man of corruption in a vacuum. He did it while wearing the medals of a military complex that has trained, funded, or tolerated dozens of regimes far worse, so long as they kept the resources flowing. But Traoré had done the unthinkable. He stopped playing by the old rules. At just 35, he rose to power not with foreign backing, but from the ranks of soldiers tired of watching their country bleed gold while their people slept hungry. He refused to beg. He refused to bow. And most of all, he refused to keep selling Burkina Faso's wealth for promises that never came. In response, he seized back control of key gold operations, shut down loopholes, reinvested directly into defense and development. The West called it autocracy. But across Africa's youth, it looked like courage. So when Langley told the U.S. Senate that Traoré was using gold to fortify his junta, the phrase struck like a match against oil. Because he wasn't just criticizing a president. He was calling into question the right of African nations to say, this is ours. And that was the line. By the time Langley made it to Nairobi, the anger had already rippled beyond Burkina Faso. Images of Traoré in cotton fields, on village visits, and signing agriculture deals were everywhere. Edited side by side with Langley sitting stiff in a Senate chair. The meme was clear. The enforcer versus the son of the soil. Even without speaking, Traoré was winning the narrative. His silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. While Langley doubled down, warning that the Sahel shift was dangerous and anti-democratic, Africans heard something else. That democracy only counts when it's designed in Washington. And the backlash? It got personal. In the village of Sagal, where Langley's roots run deep, the elders made their video, quiet, powerful and cutting. "You were born of us," one said. "And now you use your tongue against your people." It didn't come from politicians. It came from ancestors. It came from home. And in that moment, General Langley wasn't just a visitor in Africa. He became a stranger to himself. Let's pause here, and if this part of the story resonates, subscribe and share it with someone who still believes that heritage is more than history, it's duty. Because this next part, it only gets deeper. Inside Kenya, pressure mounted fast. Opposition leaders, often careful not to stir up defense matters, began asking for answers. A coalition of university professors released an open letter. "Langley's visit is a disgrace to African unity." One activist went on national TV saying, "You can't celebrate independence while hosting the face of militarized submission." The government tried to stay quiet. But the silence became an answer in itself. A leaked internal memo confirmed what many had feared. Some advisors had warned President Ruto not to host Langley. Not now. Not without first addressing his remarks against Traoré. But the summit had gone ahead anyway. For what? Military aid? Drone tech? Faster intelligence links? Whatever it was, it came with a price. And outside, the youth were sending receipts. Online, hashtags spread like wildfire. Hashtag Kenya is not AfricaRising. Hashtag we stand with Traoré. Hashtag AfricaForAfricans. Across Kenya's cities, murals of Traoré began to appear. Graffiti artists painted him with a raised fist, gold dust spilling from one hand, seeds in the other. And that image became the battle line. Two Africas stood side by side. One in armored convoys and polished shoes. The other walking barefoot with his people. One following a script. The other writing a new one. And in Nairobi, where the lines of power and protest were colliding, everyone knew. This wasn't just a summit. This was a test. A test of memory. A test of loyalty. A test of what future Africa would choose. And yet, the most important message still hadn't been delivered. Not in speeches. Not in chants. But in something older. Something sacred. Because as Langley returned to his hotel that evening, far from the noise and barricades, another voice was preparing to speak. Not the street. Not the media. But a voice from within the house. And when that voice rose, even the general would have to listen. It was quiet in the village of Sagal. Not the quiet of peace, but of waiting. Under a giant baobab tree whose roots had cracked the earth like a warning, 6 elders gathered in a circle. No stage. No cameras at first. Just presence. Generations wrapped in cloth and wisdom, seated in a silence older than borders. And then the message came. It wasn't fiery or loud. It didn't need to be. One elder leaned forward, his eyes weathered but sharp, and spoke in Wolof. "He has forgotten the drumbeat of his ancestors," he said. A young man holding a phone trembled as he filmed it. This wasn't meant for clicks. It was a message carried by memory, whispered through time, spoken across the ocean, and aimed straight at General Michael Langley. "He is a son of this land," another added in Mandinka, "but now he wears the armor of our wound." And just like that, a U.S. general, the first black man to ever lead AFRICOM, had been disowned by his ancestral kin. The video went viral in hours. Subtitled in English, French, Arabic, and Swahili. And across TikTok, Instagram, Telegram groups, it echoed. The ancestors are watching. Langley must answer to home. For decades, Black Americans in the U.S. military had carried both burden and pride, defending a country that had often denied their humanity, yet rising through its ranks in defiance of that very denial. Langley's appointment had once been celebrated as a sign of progress. But now that legacy was cracking. Because when the uniform turns its back on its own blood, what remains? And so Langley blinked. For the first time since the protests began, he issued a private statement. Leaked only to a few diplomatic circles, he called the backlash unfortunate and misunderstood. He never apologized. But he looked shaken. The kind of shaken that comes not from losing a job, but from losing a name. By then it was too late. Africa had moved on. Across the continent, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had become more than a man. He was a symbol. A story. A mirror. And Langley's attempts to tarnish him had backfired in full. In Kinshasa, his face was painted across walls with words like, "Our gold. Our guns. Our guard." In Dar es Salaam, university halls played clips of his speeches on loudspeakers between classes. In Tunis, bloggers translated his addresses into Arabic and debated his reforms live on air. He was no longer just the leader of BurkinaFaso. He was Africa's young lion. And that's when something even deeper began to take shape. Not just support for Traoré but a questioning of everything. What kind of future do we want? One where generals land quietly with promises packed in aid forms, then leave with contracts and concessions? Or one where leaders, flawed but fearless, stand with their feet in the soil and say, "This is ours and we will fight for it"? The message became impossible to ignore. Even inside Kenya, the tide turned. A protester in Kisumu put it best when she told a local news crew, "Burkina Faso's fight is our fight. If we stay silent now, we lose our voice forever." And that's what Langley's visit had done. He didn't silence the movement. He made it roar. If this part of the story resonates with you, take a moment, subscribe, share it with someone who still believes Africa deserves more than permission slips from foreign hands. And tell us where you stand in the comments. Are we ready to walk together? Because Kenya now stood at a crossroads. Two futures were on offer. One that embraced Western funding, elite training, and the slow erosion of decision-making beneath layers of defense diplomacy. And one that looked risky, wild even, but free. A future of hard-won sovereignty, regional alliances, and homegrown power. And so Nairobi, once just a conference host, became the battleground of the African soul. Langley's hotel became a symbol, guarded, distant, watched. Outside, young Kenyans spray-painted the final warning. History is no longer yours to write. And back in Ouagadougou, Traoré gave a rare public appearance. He didn't mention Langley by name. He didn't have to. Standing before a crowd of farmers, teachers, market women, and barefoot children, he raised a small bowl of local maize and said, "This is gold too. And we will protect it the same way." They erupted. Not just in applause, but in understanding. Because gold in this Africa was no longer just a metal. It was a metaphor. For land. For dignity. For choice. So what does all this mean now? It means Africa is watching. It means loyalty cannot be bought and silence can be betrayal. It means generals may still wear stars but the people wear fire. And Traoré? Whether he stands or falls, he has opened a door that cannot be closed. The continent has remembered its name. And to anyone who would still treat it like a base, a pawn, a prize, let this be your warning. The streets have spoken. The elders have spoken. The ancestors have spoken. Now it's up to us. Subscribe if you believe Africa deserves to walk its own road, strong, sovereign, and unafraid. Like this video to spread the message. And in the comments, tell us, who do you think should lead Africa into the next era? Because the story doesn't end here. It begins with you. Until next time, stay awake, stay rooted, stay ready.